So the last one of these I did on the US had an overall point to make illustrated with 3 examples. That is not the case this time. This is more of an overview with points I think are interesting and worth talking about. To me, Japan had the most interesting small arms of the Second World War because almost everything is just a Japanese adaptation of a European weapon to various extents. But despite that, they end up being the most visually distinct arsenal of the Big Six. But then, when they design something more or less domestically, it gets wacky. You just get the feeling looking at them that this is a country that approaches arms design in this period very differently from what you're used to seeing. Look, what I'm trying to say is,
I just think they're neat.
Japan is unique out of the other major powers in that their small arms are largely adapted from existing foreign weapons. For example, Japan's Type 3 heavy machine gun was a direct modification of the French Hotchkiss 1897 heavy machine gun, and became the first in a long line of Hotchkiss-based machine guns in Japanese service, as they were all copies or evolutions of the Type 3 bolt and gas system. The Hotchkiss isn't the only design Japan did this with, though. The Type 96 light machine gun was specifically designed to copy the form and ergonomics of the Czech ZB-26, the Type 14 is a reworked C-96 action, the Type 100 is an amalgamation of European submachine guns, and the Arisaka rifles are just the superior form of the Mauser. Now, I'm not saying they're doing this as a bad thing, it just isn't something you see done by the other major nations to this degree. Sure, it happens, but Japan is definitely unique at the scale they do it. So why is that? Japanese industry was stretched pretty much to its limit in the late 1930s before falling off a cliff in the 40s. But even before that, it was never as productive as the military needed it to be. Despite industrializing at an incredibly rapid rate and establishing themselves as a major power in Asia within 60 years, Japan's military ambitions were always ahead of what they could support domestically. To make up for this, they had to distribute resources and production capability very carefully on projects that would have a relatively quick turnaround, work well for their needs, and could be produced domestically. A 10-year rifle project coming up empty would be a setback for any nation. For Japan, it would be even worse, as it would set them back as they were trying to catch up still with other industrialized powers, wasting time and resources they aren't in a position to waste. The way around all of that risk is to just go shopping instead. First literally by importing foreign manufactured weapons, before transitioning to domestically produce licensed copies, and eventually moving up to producing Japanese specific variants of reliable foreign designs. That way they get exactly what they want in form and features from a weapon, without gambling the time and resources they would starting from scratch. Now, this method of arms procurement isn't unique to Imperial Japan. This is how smaller nations pretty regularly adopted weapons in this period, if full domestic R&D was either not viable or not worth it. What's notable is, I don't think anyone, the Japanese military included, would group Imperial Japan with, say, the Netherlands on any metric of military capability. In industrial capability, though, Japan was a lot closer to a minor nation than I think is commonly remembered due to the sheer area they managed to conquer and how long they were able to hold on to it before collapsing. The longer you look at Imperial Japan from the early 30s to 1945 though, the more of these little economic clues for their struggling industrial base start to jump out at you. And their shopping for small arms is one of them. Since we're talking about production and I don't know where else to put this, here's how the names work. The Imperial Japanese system for equipment designation is actually a lot like the American one, just more convoluted. Similarly to how you can have an M1 rifle, M1 helmet, M1 tractor, the Japanese had the Type 89 tank, machine gun, and grenade discharger. But unlike the American system, where the number is just sequential, the Japanese number comes from the year of adoption depending on who was emperor. All weapons adopted before July 30th, 1912 were named for the year of Emperor Meiji's reign. So here's a rifle adopted in 1897. Which is Meiji's 30th year, so it's called the Type 30. Under Emperor Taisho, they did the same thing. This is a pistol adopted in 1926. That's Taisho's 14th year as emperor. It's called the Type 14. Because emperor years start the day of Ascension, sometimes the number is off from what it should be for the year it was adopted. For example, you would think the Type 11 was adopted in 1923, 11 years after 1912 when Taisho became emperor, but we know it was put into service in 1922, meaning that Even though I don't know what specific date it was accepted on, it had to be after July 30th, 1922, within the 11th Taisho year. Towards the end of the Taisho era, the military realized that with this system, they were getting close to having repeat numbers of the same type of weapon. For example, if Taisho was still emperor in 1942, and a rifle was adopted, they would then have 2 rifles officially designated the Type 30 rifle under the current system. So once Hirohito became emperor, they started naming things by the Japanese imperial calendar that starts in 660 BC, which is nice because that means the last digit of the imperial year is the same as the last digit of the Gregorian year, making the whole system after 1926 a bit less confusing. The only small arm I found that doesn't follow this system is the Type 100, and I couldn't find out why. The prototypes did, but once adopted, it doesn't line up for some reason. Despite what's usually said, the Achilles heel of Japanese small arms wasn't their poor design or crude construction. Neither of those things are true, I'll get to that later. The biggest problem they had was being chambered in 2 separate cartridges. No other country did this, and for good reason. It was a logistical nightmare that, to their credit, I guess they actually pulled off for the most part. Japan's standard cartridge starting the war in 1931 was the 6.5x50 semi-rim Type 38. While a capable cartridge, much more than it's generally given credit for today, the Army considered a larger caliber as far back as World War I while watching the fighting in Europe, and tested a prototype rifle in 7.7mm in 1919. The project didn't go anywhere though, as 7.7 development priority was shortly after shifted to aircraft machine guns. In this role, 6.5 really was underpowered, and a larger, faster bullet was needed for both better anti-material capability, shooting at opposing planes, and more internal space for specialty rounds like tracer and incendiary. The Japanese had some experience with, and really liked, the British 303 cartridge from emergency use of British aircraft guns in 303, and ended up essentially cloning it in a semi-rimmed form, adopted as the 7.7x58mm semi-rimmed Type 89 cartridge in 1930. As that went on, the Army decided the benefits of a larger, faster bullet would also be great in heavy machine guns on the ground, and scaled up the Type 3 heavy machine gun to fire the 7.7 semi-rimmed round, adopting the Type 92 heavy machine gun in 1932. They immediately realized, though, they had created a huge logistical problem for themselves, and began development of 7.7 variants of rifles and light machine guns to become the new standard and fix the issue. Now, those of you in the know are probably thinking, hey, 7.7 isn't semi-rimmed, it's rimless. And you're right. During the light machine gun development, it was determined that 7.7 semi-rimmed didn't stack well enough in 30-round magazines to feed reliably, and that the recoil in general was too strong for handheld weapons. The conversion was still done, resulting in the Type 99 rifle and light machine gun in 1939. However, the aforementioned issues were concerning enough that they were chambered in a new 7.7x58mm rimless cartridge with a slightly reduced charge from the Type 92 ammunition. So when the quest to stop fielding 2 rounds, at the beginning of the switch in 1939, they were now fielding 3. There was a silver lining, though. It was quickly discovered that the Type 92 was able to safely fire and extract 7.7 rimless without any modifications. Semi-rim, though, would not chamber in a Type 99 rifle. So in 1940, machine gun ammunition was made rimless so that either 7.7 round could be used in any 7.7 weapon in case of supply issues. The difference in powder charge, though, from everything I could find, was kept until the end of the war. So if a soldier fired Type 92 rounds out of a rifle, he would have to adjust the sights or have the accuracy thrown off. Although that's still not ideal, it's at least down from 3 cartridges to 2, kind of. This still isn't the whole story, though. Way back in 1922, as 7.7 development was still in the early stages, the Army adopted its first light machine gun, the Contraption. Real name, the Type 11. I love this thing, and I'll talk about it for way too long later in the video, but as far as ammunition goes, it fired the standard 6.5x51 Type 38 rifle round. Once in the hands of troops, though, a pretty big problem was discovered. Because the Type 11's barrel was nearly half the length of a Type 38, it produced excessive flash when firing that, in the field, made the crew an obvious target. To fix this, A new 6.5 round specifically for the Type 11, and also used later in the Type 96, was developed with a different powder that burned more completely by the time the bullet left the barrel. These light machine gun rounds were identified by a Latin G in a circle on containers, and today are often incorrectly called reduced power ammunition, from the belief they fired at a lower pressure to aid case extraction in Japanese machine guns and help reliability. But this is wrong, and comes from a misunderstanding in a US training manual printed in 1943 that assumed the G stood for this word, meaning reduced, but it actually stands for glycerin describing the powder type. Because of the shape and volume of the granules, G ammunition does have slightly less powder than a standard round, which the manual states is the reason for the author's conclusion, but the actual pressure difference between the two is next to nothing. So, depending on how you count, Japan fielded up to 4 appreciably different cartridges by 1940, then said watch this and started the Pacific War, preventing a full conversion to 7.7. To the credit of Japanese logistics officers, I didn't find any examples of catastrophic campaign-ending issues caused by this, like the 6.5 ammo supply ship being sent to the 7.7 equipped garrison. Actually, what am I saying? It's World War II Japan. Even if the wrong supply ship was sent, it probably never arrived because it was sunk a third of the way there. One thing you'll see mentioned a lot about Japanese weapons in the West is that they were designed, in whole or in part, around jungle fighting and reliability in the Pacific. And this isn't really true. People from Western countries, which, according to my analytics is most of you, tend to think of the Japanese ground forces during the war as jungle fighting troops, mostly because that's where we fought them. But the Japanese army wasn't organized around jungle fighting any more than US ground forces in the Pacific were. It's just where they ended up. Before the 1940 invasion of Indochina, Japan in the 20th century had fought in Manchuria and wider mainland Asia in the vast majority of land warfare it was involved in. Sure, there are exceptions, but Japan's focus was empire building on the mainland. The reason they end up in the Pacific has to do with the government trying to salvage an unwinnable situation in China and the army falling out of favor. Watch this if you want the whole story. My point is, Japanese small arms were not designed with specifically a jungle climate in mind. In fact, if you went back to like 1930 and told all the designer of primary Japanese small arms about how well his work held up in the South Pacific in a war with the Dutch, British, and Americans, he'd probably look at you with concern and ask what happened. A lot, Kajiro. A whole lot. There are a couple weapons usually pointed to illustrate this point when it's made. The main one is the Arisaka, both the Type 38 and 99. And to be fair, they do have specialized features to help keep the rifle functioning in harsh conditions, like the dust cover over the action and the stock design to drain out water. The thing is, these are nice features to have anywhere you're fighting. It was just an exceptionally well-designed rifle. Dirt and moisture aren't jungle exclusive, and you could just as easily say the rifle was designed for the Western Front if you consider it to be specialized to a location by these aspects. Another is the Type 89 50mm grenade discharger, or the knee mortar, if you're not Japanese. The Type 89 was actually designed from the ground up by the Army Technical Bureau in response to reports by Japanese observers in Europe during World War I, and was intended to fill the gap in fire support between a thrown hand grenade and a dedicated mortar in close quarters combat. It fired a standard Japanese hand grenade at a range of 200 yards and was issued in pretty high numbers to Japanese troops. As you can probably guess, this was a fantastic weapon to have in the Pacific and performed very well. It just wasn't designed with the jungle in mind, but close quarters infantry combat in general. There are also features on the same weapons that were equally bad for jungle combat. For example, the Type 38 and early Type 99 rifles, for all their good features, were also really long, which is not ideal in that environment. So this whole jungle fighting sentiment is not wrong in a strict sense. Japanese weapons on the whole did well in the Pacific. They just weren't designed around it specifically. However, expand that to close quarters fighting, and you could have an argument for some of them. What was really behind Japanese success, well, not success, but I guess reputation in jungle fighting, was small unit and close quarters tactics, along with an institutional emphasis on self-sufficiency by the Japanese military to operate in places with poor infrastructure. To be completely real with you, the Japanese weren't really good at jungle fighting. Nobody who fought in the Pacific really was. The Allies would just overwhelm the Japanese with men and material until the Japanese evacuated, or the island's garrison was destroyed. Individual infantry weapons in this scenario are so far down the list of deciding factors factors, they're almost not worth mentioning. Going up one level from jungle fighting, Japanese weapon requirements in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, when most of the gang was being designed and adopted, really weren't oriented around fighting a defensive campaign on various Pacific islands. That requirement, if it even existed, would have been way down on the list. But by 1943, that's the war Japan was in. However, despite not being designed with that scenario in mind, I would argue that Japanese small arms ended up being some of the best ones you could want for it. The standout weapon in this role was the Type 92, a gun that, in a vacuum, seems like an odd choice to continue updating and fielding with how old many of its design elements were when it was adopted in the early 30s. It fed from metallic strips, required oiled cartridges, and was incredibly heavy, even by heavy machine gun standards, thanks to the huge cooling fins attached to the barrel. Before 1942, especially when fielded by such an aggressive, offensive-focused nation like Japan, it probably would have been remembered as a very mid-tier heavy machine gun. Nothing wrong with it, it worked fine, a bit outdated, but it could be worse. Post-1942 though, in a defensive position in the Pacific, it ended up being probably the best machine gun you could possibly create for that role. The comically large cooling fins made it so that you could basically never overheat this gun, and shoot for as long as you could keep it loaded, which, funny enough, was actually possible because the metallic strips it fed from could be linked together as it fired, meaning as long as you had more strips and kept linking them together, you never had to stop to reload. Those two features, paired with the gun's manageable rate of fire, meant that even an inexperienced gun crew could easily keep this thing firing non-stop until they used up all the ammunition available to them. You don't have to stop firing to swap a barrel or even load a new belt, and that makes it easily the best point defense machine gun of the war. Short tangent, but for whatever reason, the Japanese really liked cooling fins, and also put them on their light machine guns, which by the 1940s is pretty unique. The Type 11 actually had rather large ones for a light machine gun, but they got more manageable in the later Type 96 and 99, both of which still have small ones despite also having quick change barrels. Now, I'm not saying the fins made these guns capable of sustained fire, they weren't, but if you're shooting out of a bunker, they go from being a weird choice on a light machine gun to a nice thing to have. Another weapon that ended up being great for island defense was the Type 38 and 6.5. The Type 38 was adopted in 1905, and back then, infantry rifles were made really long to increase their range for volley fire and to act as pikes against cavalry with a bayonet attached. Despite these concepts being very outdated by the 1940s, the Type 38's length managed to remain an asset in Japan's defensive war, as the long barrel gave the powder in the cartridge time to burn completely before the bullet left the muzzle, producing essentially no flash when fired, a really useful feature when shooting out of a cave or bunker. Now again, these are things that are not going to change the war at all in the grand scheme of things, but it goes to show that even in an unforeseen situation, Japanese weapons were well designed and capable, and generally performed well in all theaters they were deployed in. Which needs to be stated because generally, in the English-speaking world, Japanese small arms have a terrible reputation that they really don't deserve. Sure, some could have been better, but they weren't the universally crude, unreliable, and outdated disasters you tend to see them described as. This attitude has begun to change somewhat since the internet took off, but on the whole, Japanese weapons are still unfairly judged. The biggest contributing factor to this, in my opinion, is the language barrier. Books in Japanese don't seem to get translated and published over here too often, and Western scholars, even if they speak the language, don't seem to have easy access to Japanese documents. Because of this, compared to, say, German weapons, it's really hard to find good detailed information on Japanese small arms in English. Your options are really just a handful of very expensive, hard-to-find books that usually have been out of print for decades. I know they're full of good information though, because all the articles online and books on broader subjects cite them. I just wasn't prepared for these numbers when I started this video. Without accessible academic information, first-hand experience with veteran war trophies in the United States broadly built public opinion on Japanese weapons, especially the idea that they were low quality and even dangerous. The vast majority of these weapons taken back to the States were rifles, and most of those were late war production, commonly called last-ditch rifles. Towards the end of the war, Japan began cutting every possible step they could in rifle manufacture to increase, and later just maintain, production by simplifying features and abandoning all cosmetic finish. Now, these rifles function just as as well as early production in every way that actually matters for safety and accuracy when firing, but they look really trashy and bad, not reflecting well on Japanese weapons as a whole if those are the only ones you've ever seen. This was never done to machine guns, oddly enough. They were made at the same high production standard to the very end, despite being very time and resource intensive to produce. Another, probably more impactful experience was a misunderstanding of what some of them were. Japan manufactured blank fire training weapons in fairly high numbers compared to other countries from the time, and from what I found, these were actually made by private firms and sold commercially to both the military as well as schools and youth organizations. Basically, there were a lot of them, and they were chambered for blank cartridges in the exact dimensions of 6.5 and 7.7. Many models, the rifles especially, look exactly like the real thing. The giveaway is the barrel won't be rifled, but that's not something people usually check for, especially when everything else about it looks correct. These were picked up by occupation troops after the war, thinking they had a regular Type 99 or whatever, who would then shoot them with standard ammunition and whoa, they would explode. Then, completely unaware it was actually a blank fire training rifle, would understandably conclude that it was a poorly made regular rifle. Once those stories disseminate, combined with last-ditch rifles looking so ugly that it stands to reason they might explode, you can see how pretty quickly the idea that Japanese weapons are crude, unreliable, and even dangerous would spread and solidify. These myths have become less common with the ability to correct them online, but they've been around for so long, I'm sure you'll still hear them for years to come before word fully spreads and attitudes completely turn around. As previously factually stated, the Type 11 is the coolest gun ever built. I will fully admit all the stated problems with it in service are 100% true. I don't care. It looks like someone designed a light machine gun after only having other ones described verbally, but never actually saw one before. Because everything is just off, and it gets weirder the longer you look at it. So it feeds from a hopper of 6 5-round standard Type 38 stripper clips, allowing riflemen to hand over ready-to-use ammunition without the need to transfer the rounds to a different belt or magazine first. So that's neat. In practice, though, it ended up not being the greatest idea, since being so open, it was really easy for dirt to get into the action and jam the gun. This was made worse by the need to oil cartridges as they fed to help extract them, giving the dirt something to stick to. So not ideal, and it would be replaced in 1936 by a more conventional gun. However, like a lot of Japanese weapons, it was not as much of a disaster in service as you often hear. If you could keep it clean, which sure, could be a big if depending on the climate, it would run fine. And despite being officially replaced, it was fielded until 1945. If it was as unusable as sometimes implied, that wouldn't have happened. Anyways, back to the weird stuff. Because of the hopper on the left side and the oiler on top, the sights had to go on the right side of the gun, which is why the stock is offset to the right to allow the shooter to aim. Then on top of all of that, it has these huge cooling fins for a light machine gun. It's just so weird and out there. I remember picking this thing up for the first time playing Medal of Honor Rising Sun as a kid and pausing the game to go look it up because I couldn't figure out what it was or how it was supposed to work. Actually, thinking about it now, that moment probably directly led to this video, like 20 years after it happened. Speaking of the Type 11, it's one of many weapons often called a Nambu, after its designer, Kajiro Nambu, who, in terms of sheer number of gun designs fielded by one country during the war, had the most of anyone that I'm aware of. It's well known that John Browning was responsible for, like, every other gun in American hands in World War II, and how prolific of a designer he was. What I don't think is remembered as much is that Kajiro Nambu was responsible for pretty much every gun you imagine when you think Japanese small arms. Even the Arisakas that have someone else's name attached to them have more Nambu ideas in them than their namesake. Now, as impressive as that is, it doesn't reflect a very healthy arms sector for Japan, and a few of his adopted weapons definitely would have benefited from additional competition or institutional knowledge coming from more people. But those are the exception. At the beginning, I said I didn't have an overall point to this video, but if I were to make one, it's that Japanese weapons weren't cheap garbage. They were very good at their job, and taken seriously during the war by everyone they were fielded against.